I'm imagining the holiday season 2008, and Mike DeBerardinis and John Quigley are maybe having a bagel in the bagel shop. And Mike says, you know, John, you know, I got new mayor in Philly, and I'm angling. I think I'm going to get this great new job in the city. It's just a great opportunity to get back home, and it's recreation and conservation, and it's Philadelphia, and I love it. So, but you know, I really want you to be the next Secretary of DCNR. I think it'd be great for you. And John goes, I think, you know, I don't know, Mike. And it's and Mike says, no, man, it's the best job in the world, you know. You just travel around the state, you hand out money, everyone loves you. And, you know, John's a pretty smart guy, so he goes, you know, Mike, isn't that money kind of drying up? And Mike goes, oh no, you know, I know the land trusts and the other environmental groups, they're plotting and stuff. They're going to get this severance tax on Marcellus Shale to fund a whole new grant program. There's going to be plenty of money. And you know, every other state has a severance tax. You know, this is in the can. And so, you know, John kind of ponders that and goes, well, you know, speaking of this, you know, this natural gas stuff and stuff, I'm really nervous about the state forests. You know, what's going to happen? Are we going to be, you know, pressured by industry and everything else to do stuff? And Mike says, you know what? You know, that's you're in the clear, man. You know, I'll tell you, you know what, 50 years, 100 years, you know, the General Assembly, you know, has never told this agency what to do, you know, with the forest. You know, hey, we determine what levels we're going to log at, what kind of, you know, revenues there's going to be. You know, we're in full control here. And John goes, oh, okay. And then Mike says, and here's the best thing, John. You know, speaking of the shale and the forest and stuff, you know, there's this thing called the Oil and Gas Lease Fund. And, you know, believe it or not, this money, whenever we lease land, I mean, we just leased a bunch of land for gas drilling, all the money from leasing flows into this fund. And guess what? The Secretary of DCNR gets total and complete control on how you use it. It's like the candy shop. You can choose exactly how to spend this stuff. And John goes, you know, I think you sold me on it. Okay, I'll go for it. Well, you know, for those of you who haven't been paying attention or are new to Pennsylvania, you know, we don't have a severance tax yet on natural gas extraction because, in spite of just about every other state in the nation having it, the Oil and Gas Lease Fund was tapped by the governor and the General Assembly to take care of general fund issues. And, well, and for the first time, the legislature has actually dictated to DCNR, instead of saying, hey, DCNR, go do your job in the state forests, it said, you know, DCNR, you will extract this amount of money each year from the state forest. So it's not been pretty, and all joking aside, I think John was fairly aware of a lot of this stuff coming in. I think he knew pretty well, or at least he probably knew 20% of it or 30%. I'm not sure. I imagine it's more than probably any of us dreamed of as far as a problem. But John has been a great person to have in the role of Secretary of DCNR. He's been an incredible champion for conservation. I think, you know, I think of, you know, you have different titles and there's state forester and stuff. And, you know, now would be the time to create the title of state conservationist, because John has been our state conservationist. Now, I paid attention to Larry Schweiger last night and his story, so I know you give John the title state conservationist, the next thing you know, you have you know, someone else coming in, James Watt, becoming a state conservationist, so we wouldn't want that. But in my mind, John is our state conservationist, and that I'd like you to come forward, John, and thank you.
Thank you, Andy. That was very kind of you. Actually, that conversation did take place in December of 2008. I believed him. So clearly I've been had. But I'm going to get the last laugh because I get to introduce Mike later. So he'll get his. No, all seriousness aside. Andy, thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm a little bit humbled standing up here this morning. I mean, they were very kind words, Andy, and they touched me. We heard Larry Schweiger last night talk about standing on the shoulders of giants. And some of the names, both bright and perhaps less well known, that he talked about that have influenced him and influenced the conservation movement in Pennsylvania. And I'll be talking about the first secretary of DCNR, John Oliver, a little bit later, and then introducing the second secretary of DCNR. And I got to be honest with you, looking at what all of those individuals have accomplished, it's humbling to be standing up here with the title that I have today. And it underscores for me the importance of what we're about together, and really what is at stake here for the state. And that's really what I would like to talk about this morning, is what is at stake, where we are, where we need to go, and how we need to get there. We stand this morning 100 years after the birth of the conservation movement in Pennsylvania at what I think is a defining moment. I think it's a turning point, and indeed I think it is not an exaggeration to say we are at a moment of crisis for conservation. And I use that word very intentionally. The dictionary, or at least dictionary.com, because I'm a little bit too lazy to actually pick up the book, defines the word crisis as the stage in a sequence of events in which the trend of all future events, for better or worse, will be decided. I think we are at a stage, at a point of crisis. You've probably heard of the phrase or the saying that's often said as a favorite of John F. Kennedy's, that the Chinese character for crisis contains danger and opportunity. Well, the dangers in our moment of crisis, I think, are pretty obvious. A state that is water-rich, at least on paper, continues to face pervasive, persistent, and maybe I should say continues to fail to face pervasive and persistent concerns about water quality, and we face a looming challenge about water quantity in what is presumed to be a water-rich state. Sprawl continues to devour our fields and forests at record rates, and we're still one of the fastest sprawling states in the country. We're changing the climate, threatening the resources that we love and everything that dwells in or on the earth, and we're doing it. As Larry Schweiger talked about last night, we're doing it. We're in the deepest recession since the Great Depression, and our budget has been slashed. And the right's answer to that problem, and indeed every problem, is cut taxes and cut spending, or lease some more state forest land. Our largest source of conservation funding, Growing Greener 2, expires at the end of December. You may, for those, and we're kind of in this setting, so I think this is appropriate. In the book of Genesis, there's a story about the dream of Pharaoh as interpreted by the prophet Joseph, who foretold 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty. Well, we're exiting the years of plenty, and we could very well be facing 7 years of famine. I hope it doesn't last that long, but it has every prospect of lasting that long, given the mentality that holds sway in Harrisburg and frankly, particularly in the Senate. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later and create some more trouble for myself. As Andy mentioned, the Oil and Gas Fund, one of the most successful conservation programs in the history of the United States, was effectively repealed last October in a back room when the fiscal code bill was passed and the General Assembly took it upon itself to decide how to appropriate future revenues from the Oil and Gas Fund. And then we have Marcellus, which is going to be the single biggest force and impact on this state in its history. It will dwarf the impact of mining. And we know the numbers all too painfully well. 3,000 miles of streams that don't support aquatic life, 250,000 acres of abandoned mine lands. That will be dwarfed by the impact of Marcellus. Absolutely dwarfed. It will gouge the face of this state on a scale far, far more vast than any previous wave of resource extraction, be it mining or be it timbering. And I think we've hardly scratched the surface. And to top that off, gobs of gas industry cash are washing over Harrisburg like tar balls on a beach. And they are buying off legislators, and they are inordinately influencing public policy, and the results are predictable. We stand at a moment where Pennsylvania could repeat its history of botching resource extraction. In all of the previous waves of resource extraction in this state, we've screwed it up, and we have privatized profit and socialized cost, and we are at a moment where we face a threat of repeating that mistake and ignoring the advice of George Santayana, who wrote that those who fail to remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Should I sit down now? No, I'm not going. Whether you want me to or not, I'm not going to. Let me balance the scales a little bit and talk about the opportunities. Together in the last 7 years, we have done great work. You have done great work and begun what I think is the essential task of changing the game of conservation, changing the rules, changing how it is played, and most importantly, changing the outcome of the game of conservation. With your help, we've engaged communities in new ways, and thanks in great part to you, counties have stepped up to the plate and invested in open space conservation really as never before. Communities are greening themselves, and we've worked together to invest about $190 million to preserve 136,000 acres of land across this state in deals totaling about $529 million. We've made a significant investment in land conservation. We've seized opportunities. And most importantly, I think we've realized in a fundamental way that land preservation, as inherently important as it is not enough. That we need to take the game of conservation to a new level. We need creative and innovative and aggressive approaches. We need to find the linkages between communities and economies and our natural resources. We need to help citizens and communities place conservation at the center of their ambitions and at the center of their economic revitalization strategies. And that we have to do this work in an intimate relationship with communities, to have a real dialogue as a partner, as a listener, as a supporter, and not as a dictator from Harrisburg. So we've worked with all of you to tie this wonderful work together in these concepts so that conservation now is economic development in Pennsylvania. And that's a message that I'll talk about a little bit later that I think is going to be incredibly important in the gubernatorial campaign because we have two candidates from Pittsburgh who frankly don't get our stuff, at least to the level that we think they need to and the level that Pennsylvania needs them to get it. But our Conservation Landscape Initiative work, which sprang from the minds of Mike DeBerardinis and Cindy Dunn, is our effort and our response to the challenge of 21st century conservation, to make those connections, to make conservation relevant, to make it the centerpiece of community ambition and revitalization strategy, so that the sense of place, the sense of the natural assets and the historical assets and the cultural assets can all be blended together and present a powerful set of tools to communities. And in the process, we get to advance our work. So it's pretty clever. Some would argue it's a Trojan horse, but I think it's the essential way forward for the state. It's the essential way forward for the communities. To look beyond boundaries, to look beyond jurisdictions, to create partnerships in which state agencies work together in an unprecedented way to leverage themselves, to create synergies, and most importantly, to have an engagement with communities, to show them that government can work, to give the lie to the Reagan-era myth that government can't get out of its own way, that government can't do anything good, that government just takes. We have proven across this state, in more than half of the counties in this state, in our landscape level work, that government can make a difference. It can be a force for good. It is an empowering force in the life of Pennsylvania. That, I think, is important. This idea of conservation through community engagement is a national and it's an international model. And I say this sometimes harshly and I get yelled at, but the federal government has seen this. They have seen the power of what we're doing in Pennsylvania, and they've adopted it in their Treasured Landscape program. So we have become, thanks to all of you, a national model for 21st century conservation. Now, some may ask, that all sounds good. Is it effective? Well, more than a year ago, we commissioned the pair studies to really look at whether or not this idea, this concept of conservation through community engagement and conservation as economic development really does work. And you have in your packets a summary report that talks about the successes and it talks about the results of these evaluations, and they show us that this idea of CLIs, this concept of CLIs, do work. That strong partnerships and strategic grant making and meaningful engagement with communities pays off. The results are more vibrant communities, communities that are empowered, communities that are connected to their resources, communities that are better places to live, that have brighter futures because of our engagement. In your report, you'll see a lot of on-the-ground success stories. And I want to walk through, just very quickly, some of the important results of the study because I think they're important to highlight. In CLIs across this state, and we have 7 of them, in, again, more than half of the counties of this state, tourism has created increases in every economic indicator that you could care to look at. And one example is the Pennsylvania Wilds, a 12-county region in the north-central part of the state where tourism and economic development measures significantly outperform the rest of the state, whether it's overnight leisure travel, visitor spending, tourism, employment, tax revenues, all outperforming the rest of the state. In the CLIs, we've protected 66,000 acres of land and protected parks in the process. Visitors have seen enhanced experiences because we've been able to invest about $126 million in CLI-based public facilities. We're seeing communities that are connected to the outdoors in new ways. You all know about the Great Allegheny Passage and what's happening in the Laurel Highlands. I was out in the borough of Connellsville about a month ago to present a grant check, one of the last grant checks, Mike. You left me one that I could pass out. And I was talking with 2 of the borough officials who told me that they were so excited to tell me that there were 6 new businesses setting up shop in the little borough of Connellsville, all because of the connection and the embrace of the Great Allegheny Passage. And when you hear community officials, the part-time people who make this state work, and I'm a recovering local official, and I know how difficult it is, when you hear those folks with such excitement in their voices tell you about what's happening in their communities, the transformation that is happening in their communities because of the connection that they have embraced with recreation and conservation and the natural assets of an area, that is truly transformative work. And it's exciting work, and it's profoundly exciting to me. We have seen local governments get engaged with conservation and become actual champions of this work. And the story I like to tell the most is up again in the Pennsylvania Wilds. When the Pennsylvania Wilds initiative was started, say about 10 years ago, we were the black helicopter crowd. DCNR was up there sniffing around. The idea was to kill all the deer, expropriate the land, and sell it to the United Nations for a biosphere. And I'm not exaggerating. That was what they thought we were doing. We were the black helicopter crowd. But today, in fact, in 2005, the 12-county Pennsylvania Wilds planning team created an intergovernmental cooperation agreement, which is the largest in the history of this state. So an area that was incredibly skeptical of state government and incredibly skeptical of planning and working together and collaboration and pretty much anything having to do with government has embraced this and actually put pen to paper in the largest intergovernmental cooperative agreement in the history of this state. I think that's pretty powerful. We've seen, for example, in the Lehigh Valley that the citizens are volunteering to advise their communities, advise their planning commissions, and getting involved in new ways. And certainly we've seen in state government a significant change in the way government works. We've been able to engage DCED and PennDOT and the Fish and Boat Commission and the Department of Health together, working collaboratively and investing, co-investing in projects as never before. One of the biggest proponents of trails in this state is the Deputy Secretary for Transportation, which I think is pretty exciting, that they have seen that light and bought into this idea of working together and making profound change across the state. And of course, this work in a very fundamental way has transformed DCNR. Mike used a very beautiful phrase, I thought, and he said prior to the advent of the CLI approach, we were focused on the resource. We were facing the parks. We were facing the forests. And this work challenges us to turn and face communities and to embrace communities. And the women and men at DCNR have done that in absolutely glorious fashion and have done just inspiring work. And all of that really, in my mind, defines what a 21st century approach to conservation needs to be. Now, is this CLI approach perfect? No. Are there lessons that we can learn? Yes. Are there things that we can do better? Yes. But the fundamental lessons of the CLIs are that place matters, working landscapes matter, local government matters, visitors matter, learning by doing matters, and public investment matters. That is the key. And so many of us working together, I think, grasp that as pretty obvious, that public investment is the key to making this happen, that government is the key, government is the linchpin in making this effort work. And that illustrates the fragility of the effort, because obviously Growing Greener 2 runs out, and our remaining funding sources are a shadow of Growing Greener 2. Revenues are down across the board. There's a clear need for Growing Greener 3, a clear need to continue to invest in a shared future, in a shared vision for this state, and that we are in a time frame that is going to make it very difficult to stay out of a time of famine for at least a few years. And that is going to challenge all of us to be more creative and more agile and more collaborative than we have even been over the last 7 years. And clearly, we need to have a serious, serious conversation in this state about the role of conservation, about its place in communities, in politics, in public policy. And you need, all of you, need to have a clear and strong and loud voice in that discussion. And this is, I think, particularly so because of our old friend Marcellus. Over the last 7 years, we have demonstrated and forged a connection between sustainable community prosperity and protecting natural lands. We've conserved 136,000 acres of land and worked real hard to do it, invested a lot of money to do it. But consider that 136,000 acres of protected land against the at least 7 million acres of land in Pennsylvania that is currently under lease for drilling by the natural gas industry. There's 29 million acres of land in Pennsylvania, and there are conservatively 7 million acres of that leased for drilling. A quarter of the land area of this state has been leased by the natural gas industry. Talked about the Pennsylvania wilds. Well, 55% of the state forest in the Pennsylvania wilds, the very asset that they depend on for their future, is leased for natural gas drilling. So I would suggest to you that the face of this state and the character of Penn's Woods and its communities is going to change fundamentally. It will change radically, and in some cases, it will change permanently. This state is going to surpass Oklahoma this year as the #2 state in the country with active drilling rigs. We will be behind only Texas in the number of active drilling rigs in our state. That's profoundly different Pennsylvania. So what will Pennsylvania look like 8 years from now, 18 years from now, 80 years from now? And I want to challenge you this morning because I believe that how Pennsylvania answers those questions of what we will look like 8 and 18 and 80 years from now is up to you. It is literally up to you and to all of us. Now, that is an enormous challenge, and it's easy to be daunted by the danger of the moment and this crisis instead of owning the opportunity. So let's just take a break here for a second. I'll try to back it off a little bit. A couple of years ago, I was asked to talk at a bureau meeting. Our facility design and construction team had a meeting at the Kings Gap Environmental Center, up the old Maslin Mansion on top of a mountain. And it was early in the morning on a spring day, and I was driving up this 4-mile road that snakes up the mountain to get to the mansion. We like to call it the world's longest driveway, and it was recently repaved. And I was driving up there, and it was one of those mornings in the spring where the green, the color of green, is just so lush and so vibrant and so alive. And you only see that color maybe about a week during the year, but the forest was lush with new growth, and the canopy was overhead. And I was enveloped by this greenness, this cool greenness. And it felt like a mother's embrace. And it took my breath away. In fact, I almost drove off the road. And that, I think, illustrates how lame this story is, because I was driving a friggin' car, the Conservation Secretary driving a car, and I'm sure all of you have had much more glorious moments in conservation and a connection to nature, but that's life for a rump-end secretary like me. But that moment took my breath away. And I was just struck by it. I came back to the office a little while later, and I went in and I talked to Jim Grace, who is our deputy secretary and resident philosopher. And I was telling him this. I said, Jim, it felt like a mother's embrace. I was just so touched in the moment. My hair on the back of my neck stood up. I was just overwhelmed. But I can't put my finger on how I felt. And Jim said, oh, that's easy. Joyful. That's it. Joyful. There is such joy in what we do. Such reverence. Such inspiration. And we've got to continue to take inspiration from the natural world and our work to protect it. But there is something even more fundamental in our work, and that is something that is fundamental to our democracy. And it's nowhere better expressed than in the passage from Article 1, Section 27 of the Pennsylvania Constitution that Larry quoted from memory that I can't. Having passed 50, I can't remember stuff anymore. But Article 1, Section 27 says that the people have a right to clean air, pure water, and to the preservation of the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment. Pennsylvania's public natural resources are the common property of all the people, including generations yet to come. As trustee of these resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all the people. So we, in this room, I think in a very special way, are the defenders of the commons. We're the defenders of a democratic society where the richest person in the state and the poorest person of the state are on equal footing and have equal access to our shared natural bounty. That is a value that cannot be lost. It is not for sale. And it is for all of us and our grandchildren and generations of Pennsylvanians yet unborn. So this moment of crisis, these times that President Obama talks in what I think is a particularly effective phrase, the fierce urgency of now, cries out for a 21st century conservation movement that matches or maybe even has to exceed the vision and the work and the audacity of Pinchot and Rothrock and Goddard. They didn't shrink from the dangers of the moment. They seized the opportunities despite the dangers. They made a conservation movement happen. They either ignored the politics of the day or they surmounted the politics of the day and bent it to their wills. And we in this room are the heirs of that legacy. And we must, and I think we can, do the same. And it starts now, because we're going to elect half of the Senate, all of the House of Representatives, and a governor this November. It has to start now. We have to make conservation an issue in this election and make sure it remains an issue after the election and forever after. We have to be smart and clever and creative and get through the famine and work to reestablish the times of plenty. We have to be passionate, we have to be eloquent, we have to be tenacious, because this is a fight not only for the resource, it's a fight for our birthright and the kind of society that we want to have for ourselves, for our children, and for our grandchildren. We have to be bold. We have to be bold. Michelangelo wrote that the greater danger for most of us lies not in setting our aim too high and falling short, but in setting our aim too low and achieving our mark. We are at a moment of crisis, and the opportunity is before us. And folks, we have what we need. We have everything we need. We have all of you. We have your organizations and your networks and communities and students and citizens across this state who are alive to conservation, who, in the work of our communication shop, who take conservation personally. We have what we need. We can continue this magnificent, joyful work. We can make Growing Greener 3 a reality. We can get meaningful climate change and clean energy legislation passed. We can elevate the multiple values of conservation. We can continue to lift up conservation as an economic revitalization tool. We can reaffirm the transformative power of conservation and ensure that it has its rightful place in public policy. I am convinced that we can do all of these things. And I'm confident that we can write a new chapter in the history of a movement that has its roots right here in Pennsylvania. The only question before us this morning, the only question is, will we? And that is up to you. Thank you.